Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the causes of inflation. Now, this was brought home recently. I was just in the shop a couple of days ago, the grocery store, and an item that we like has just gone up by just over 30%. It was like $11 a kilogram, like that's just over £2 for American audiences. $11 a kilogram. 4 days ago, and I went to the shop a couple of days ago, and it's now $16 a kilogram. So 40% or something price increase in one hit. Now, I did some research and sort of had a look around. There's been no change in any of the inputs or anything that I can find, raw material costs, that sort of thing. And so other than, say, the increasing cost of gasoline, petroleum, there's no input cost that I can see that would cause anything other than, even if you're generous, a 10% price increase, and even that would be excessive. So, but this is not unusual with across a whole range of products, fresh food product, meat, for example. All meat seems to be surprisingly going up in price, all in unison. And that seems a little suspicious because it's happening in unison all over the world at the same time. So that suggests, globalist scam there. But just looking at inflation, now there's a big thing again raging all across the Western world at the same time. So again, that it's globalist inspired and globalist directed, globalist scripted. That all across the Western world there's a terrible shortage of not only labour, not only workers, but of skilled workers, and this is just diabolical. Unemployment is at incredibly low levels, lowest since before God, and so clearly the situation is dire. It's an emergency of the first order, and the only way to solve it is to bring in masses of third world peasants who don't speak a lick of English, but who are somehow all highly skilled at the same time. But there you go. So that's the rent. So they're claiming worker shortage, skill shortage, unemployment at incredibly low levels. The only solution is, but if we don't do this, the globalists and their flunkies and stooges tell us, if we don't bring all these peasants into the West by the gazillion, then wage inflation will run riot, and wages just go through the roof. Inflation will be out of control, and we're all going to die. It's possibly as bad as climate change. And but if you're against bringing all these people in, and that's it, then you are Hitler. So there you go. They've got it covered off. There's the denunciations, there's the emergency, the fake emergency, and so on and so forth. So, but I just want to have a look at inflation and say, well, are wages the cause of, or the primary cause of, or even the principal cause of price inflation? So now I would argue not, and I'll go through the reasons why. Now the globalist control corporations, media, and everything, they're all lying about the causes of inflation. But so if there is inflation, how can it be dampened down? Let's suppose there is high inflation. Well, you can dampen down, say, economic activity overall by really pushing up interest rates. Big jump in interest rates will slow down the amount of loans that a bank will give, and only those that have large amounts of collateral will be able to get loans. So there's less money moving around because less loans coming in, and loans, whether it's to start up a business or to buy consumer goods or buy a motor vehicle or a house or anything like that. So that's one way, and that doesn't sort of necessarily reduce inflation. It reduces economic activity, which in turn reduces inflation. So it's a two-step process there. Another way to do it is to increase productivity faster than wages or indeed other input costs. So if the other wages or fuel or any input costs increase, then if you can increase productivity at a faster rate, then that reduces inflation. So The reverse is the case, where productivity declines while input costs don't decline at a similar rate or a greater rate. Then that is inflationary insofar as the productivity declines. Another way is to reduce production or operating costs through greater efficiency, such as via invention or innovation. In the same way that the spinning jenny sort of increased productivity of cloth production back in the day, and this had a major effect on increasing productivity, reducing the price of a yard of cloth, and thus the productivity increased at a sharp rate, whilst the price of they producing the cloth in this case went down. So that's very non-inflationary there. Another way is to send production offshore to peasant wage, low cost of living countries where $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year is considered a good wage. I've been to countries where $5,000 a year is a solid middle class wage. So and that's sort of a tenth, less than a tenth of what the average wage is in most Western countries. So sending production offshore means that you're moving production from a higher wage economy, the Western economy, and then you're moving that production to a low wage economy. Now that has a number of things. It doesn't mean productivity increases, as in productivity of output. It means productivity of capital increases. So you've got less money to build a factory, and you can maintain a certain level of output because the wages are so low. Now, productivity actually sharply declines. So productivity output actually goes down sharply when you move production to a low wage, peasant wage economy. In fact, the wages are so low in some of these places that it's not even worth putting capital equipment in, such as lathes and production lines and so on. The wages are so low, you just have people sitting at desks with a soldering iron or something and making stuff or sewing on buttons to clothes and the like. So productivity goes down. Now, when you move production offshore, the cost of the goods falls, but then so does the quality of manufacture. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The other way to reduce inflation is to import vast amounts of low-wage peasant labour. So this artificially dampens down wage growth. But coming back to the issue, are wage increases or even wages just a major cause or primary cause of inflation? Wage increases in a growing and productive economy don't cause inflation. So it's not that. So the economy has to be relatively stagnant if wage increases cause any inflation at all, or if wages are to be the cause of inflation. Now, manufacturing represents the broadest option for any economy to increase its productivity, because you can have economies of scale, you can have various efficiencies to planning, you can source, better raw materials or cheaper raw materials, or you can have just-in-time inventory control. There's a whole lot of things you can do because you can fix a production line. Say, okay, for this 8 hours or whatever period of time, we're going to produce 100 widgets, and then you can plan all around that to achieve maximum efficiency on some fixed points of start and finish. When you have variable points of start and finish, it's much harder to increase productivity because there are just too many other variables to consider. But when you can limit the variables and reduce it, you can then start planning. And that's where productivity increases can come from, apart from invention or innovation, such as a new cutting machine or a new lathe or a new drill or something like that does things 10 times faster and so on. So, but manufacturing represents the broadest and biggest option for productivity increases. But the West has lost most of that because most of the manufacturing has been sent offshore. Anything other than the highest value add manufacturing is mostly offshore now. Now, there are some small production run stuff that's still in the West where a company wants stuff made, but it's a smaller production run. But anything in the mass production side of things at the low value add and medium value add has gone offshore. So the West has lost its opportunity to have productivity increases. So when economists and politicians say, well, we have to increase productivity in the West, that's very hard to do in a services-based economy There's really only two ways of doing it in a service base to increase productivity. You get people to work longer hours for the same pay, or you reduce their pay and they work the same amount of hours. So in reality, there's the latitude for productivity increases, they call it, is very limited. Now, you can look at things like organizational structure, better trained management, better quality management. Those things do make a difference. But the West, we're going in the opposite way on that. The management that we see around has never been lower quality. There's far more emphasis on race and gender quotas and affirmative action and things like that than there ever has been. And so this is having a terrible drag on Western economy. So any chance of achieving productivity increases through organisational structure and so on is being squandered and frittered away by absurd, crazy, and very self-destructive affirmative action policies. Similarly, if you look at pretty much any company now, any business. The amount of people, diversity officers, HR officers, inclusion officers, the list goes on, and so there's this vast array of jobs that's been created specifically for minorities, so they can do their moral posturing and inflict their snotty attitudes on everyone else, and generally terrorise the real workers with ever new and insane forms of wokeism. So there's this vast array of jobs that exist only as just a globalist enabling and enforcement function. They're not there to actually do a job or produce anything, create anything, achieve anything. They're simply there in these created jobs, which are a huge drag on productivity in business. And similarly, to support those crazy jobs and the madness of the gender and race quota stuff, is the governments are increasingly allowing, permitting, encouraging, indeed facilitating monopolies, oligopolies, and cartel pricing. So efficiency is decreasing through that means as well. So productivity is declining on the basis of less competition, far less competition, but that loss of competition is what's needed to shore up the globalist project of all these race and gender quotas and so on. So there's a lot of strains on productivity. So when these politicians talk about productivity, there's nothing left for it other than to make you work longer hours for the same pay, or the same hours for less pay. And so inflation is part of what that is, if you like, squeezing your purchasing power, and through that there's a form of productivity increase, insofar as money moves to areas where it is profitable for the elite, but is reduces the purchasing power of everyone else. So services, productivity and services economy are much harder to achieve for those reasons I've just mentioned. But but over the last 20 odd years, pay rates have been pretty stagnant, and in relation to cost of living, they've been declining quite substantially. So purchasing power has been going down like a lead balloon. So over the last 20 years, where wage increases have been minimal, if not non-existent, has there also been inflation in the economy? Well, the globalist trained and directed and scripted economists say, well, no, there hasn't been inflation. But over that 20 years, house prices, as an example, in the big Western cities have increased, notionally by 600%. They certainly have in Sydney. So a house in Sydney that was sold for $340,000 in the year 2000 is sells today for $2.2 million. So a little bit over 600%. So clearly there's been massive inflation. Now, unlike consumer goods, where you've got the option of buying them or not, if you don't want to, you can go without this. Housing, you can't. Housing is an essential of life, like food and energy. So that's inflation that bites hard at every citizen that doesn't own a lot of property, I guess. So, and rents similarly have gone up. Rents in parts of Sydney that have gone up by 400-500+%. And the globalists are pushing their puppet stooges in government, Western governments, to bring in more hundreds, thousands, indeed millions of people into the West when there's already quite serious shortages in housing availability. So now, sure, a lot of these third world peasants will live 20 to a one-bedroom apartment and that sort of thing. But that's hardly the point. There's already a shortage, which is meant to be illegal, by the way, but local governments do nothing about it. 20 to a room. There's I think you can have a maximum of 3 people in a one-bedroom apartment. Is the local county council ordinances, but when the third world peasants live 20 to a one-bedroom apartment, the local inspectors and rangers just look the other way and forget about it. So if you look at other things, energy and food and so on, all the essentials of life that have undergone some pretty substantial inflation. Now, sure, there have been in consumer goods, for example, household electronics, some clothes, shoes, that sort of thing. They're cheaper now relative to purchasing power than they were 20 years ago. Not by much, but they are. So, but the quality has declined substantially. Most clothing that you buy now, though it may be cheaper, unless it's in the top range of the known brands, these clothes don't last. I can buy t-shirts, sure, they're $5, but they last one summer. I mean, maybe half a dozen washes, and the colour's already gone out of them. They're faded to the point where you can almost see through them. So I've still got to pay top dollar if I want a quality t-shirt that's going to last me a few years. So we get cheaper consumer goods, but we have to replace them far more often. So across a 10-year period, say, it's still going to be cheaper to buy the more expensive item of clothing, in as much as I'll still have it in 10 years, even though it cost me, for example, $50. But I had to go through 10 of the cheaper t-shirts, and they're all useless now. I use them as cleaning cloths, for example. So inflation actually was running rampant during this time when wages were not increasing. And as I say, inflation was running rampant in the areas, not in consumer goods, which are optional and discretionary, but in the things that you must have: food, energy, petroleum, gasoline, and housing. You can't do without those things. So that inflation was an absolute whammy onto wage earners and salary earners, and that's what's reduced the purchasing power and thus the standard of living of it. So wages played no part in that in that inflation. So that goes to demonstrate that most of the inflation we've seen in the Western world over the last 20 plus years has come from areas that have had nothing to do with wage inflation. Now, on top of that, as most of the manufacturing was offshore of consumer goods, then wage inflation in the West similarly had next to nothing to do with that. So what we've got is a category of job now in the West, and there's been an explosion of low-paid jobs, which is in the people that work in the takeout chicken shops. They clean the hotel rooms. They're what are called chefs. They're the dishwashers. They're the people that work in the retail stores for the absolute minimum wage, people that work in warehouses for the minimum wage. Those are the jobs that have been designated by the globalists as low-paid jobs. So there's no market forces operating here. If you want to get workers there, you pay them more. No. It's been decided that category of job will not be allowed to have any market forces affecting it. So people won't be allowed to make more than the absolute minimum in those jobs. And so that's where the imported workers will come in to make sure that's damped down. But you see the same thing in say, computer coding. Now, I've sort of been involved in and run teams that have been coding, software coding, and without exception, certainly in my experience, I've found, say, the Indian, the cheap Indian and Pakistani, whatever, the Indian subcontinent coders, they were certainly a lot cheaper than the local guys, but the quality of their work was much lower. Also, they took much longer to do work, and their quality was much lower, and they're also quite duplicitous in their dealings with us, which I didn't like, because you always had to be on the lookout for that. And in the end, as much as my bosses were sort of, they wanted to get on the bandwagon of, all this cheap labour out there, and they speak English. But I had to sort of demonstrate to them, look, they are cheaper up front, as in a per hour cost, but given the quality of their work is so poor relative to decent quality white guys, given that, then it's just not worth using them. So again, we see this when work sent offshore at a lower headline per hour wage rate, the overall cost of doing business. We're looking at the decreases in productivity and so on. I mean, that it's not really a benefit of anything material, and it's better to keep those jobs, in my view at least, and better to keep those jobs in the West. So what the multinational Western firms have done, they've arbitraged, that means, traded off. They've arbitraged productivity. So they've given away productivity, because productivity is the only way to efficiently produce a profit in the West. Whereas if you send it, your factory to a third world country, the productivity comes from exploiting the low wages, not from the productivity of outcome. So again, it's productivity of capital employed. They're chasing. So they've arbitraged it too. So we're prepared to let go of productivity of output in return for getting our hands on those juicy low wages. So in some cases, the factories the wages are so cheap, the factory consists of just rows and rows of people sitting there with soldering irons or sewing on buttons on a garment by hand or something like that. There's not the automation that you'd see in the West. Now, through the automation and the use of automation and the skillful, imaginative, innovative use of automation, productivity can be increased substantially. Now, in turn, that does reduce the price of goods, but it also creates other jobs in the West, such as the people to service the machines and some of those high-tech jobs like that. So they're all lost when you send stuff overseas. So looking at this inflation, are wages a major driver? Well, no, and nor have they been. The major driver of inflation is other things, such as masses of offshore money coming into the West from every, China in particular, but also India and Russia and the likes, where they're buying up swathes of Western real estate for money laundering effectively, and if not, then speculation. There are certain towns and villages in India where they all pool their money from the same wider family or tribe and speculate in Australian real estate, that sort of thing. But these people are all pricing out the local indigenous folks, if you like, from participating in the real estate. And this, of course, is causing massive inflation, and the government does nothing about it. Part of the reason for that is most of the politicians in the West now, certainly in Australia, they derive more than half their total annual income from real estate speculation, and they're very, very well looked after by the big financial firms that find them remarkably, incredibly underpriced pieces of real estate, and then they're able to match them up with incredibly cashed up buyers a year later, so that they make windfall profits on their real estate transactions. So the Western politicians now are wedded to this idea of huge inflation in the real estate sector, because that's where a lot of their income comes from now. So I hope that gives you a wider view of what causes inflation and what can reduce inflation. So on the idea of this inflation being reduced, bring down the cost of housing, bring down the cost of energy, bring down the cost of food. Those are the things that are going to reduce the rate of inflation. But they're not what the globalists and their stooges in Western governments are talking about. To them, it's they tell this terrible lie that it's wage inflation is the enemy, and the only way to fix that up is to bring in millions of again third world illiterate peasants. So that's my take on it. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.